Well, good morning. If you want to turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel, we're going to be looking at really mainly chapters 14 and 15 today, although we'll spend just a little time in chapter 13. So far, what we've been looking at, at least what we looked at last week, was Saul's initial rise as Israel's king and some of the successes that he was enjoying at the beginning. At the same time, we started to discover that what Israel was getting in Saul was really a king after their own heart rather than a king after God's heart. And so in chapter 13, which we talked about last week, we saw how things began to unravel under Saul's leadership and how Saul, as Israel's king, was really leading them further away from God, not closer to God. And really, some of this happens very quickly where Saul and Jonathan have enjoyed some successes, and then all of a sudden there's this Philistine army that's come out to fight them, and they're kind of going out on raids and all kinds of things. And Saul finds himself in a precarious position. And so, if you remember, Samuel had told Saul, "Go to Gilgal and wait 7 days, and then I'm going to come to Gilgal, and I'll, give you a word from the Lord, do sacrifices, all that." And so Saul sees the enemy sort of circling, and Samuel hasn't shown up. And you remember what Saul does. Instead of waiting for Samuel to come, he does what? He assumes the role of priest. He assumes the role of prophet in that sense, and he makes his own sacrifices instead of waiting for Samuel to make those sacrifices. Now, there is something here that we'll find in the story of David where David does something kind of similar to this. We'll get there when we get there. But his heart is fundamentally different than Saul's, and we'll see that contrast made throughout the story of Samuel. But nevertheless, he makes the sacrifices, and as he's finishing the sacrifice, Samuel comes around the corner, and I didn't get a chance to read some of these verses. I just want to read a couple to you. This is 1 Samuel 13 and verse 11. Samuel said to Saul, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, 'Now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord.' So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." I think I mentioned last week that you get this multi-layered series of excuses. I'm sure that as a child, I made this kind of excuse to my parents. I'm sure that my children will make these kind of excuses to me, right? But he says, "Well, let me tell you why I did what I did. There's about 10 reasons why I did." And so he says, the people were running away. You were late. The enemy was upon us. And I didn't want to, because I value you, but I forced myself to do this. Of course, Samuel sees right through that and says, that's nonsense. But the chief thing that Saul is doing here is he's looking for justification. He's looking for an excuse as to why his behavior is acceptable. Now, the question that we would be forced to ask ourselves then is, to what degree in our relationship with God and with other people are we looking for excuses to justify ourselves, right? When we know that we've done something wrong, but we can come up with a string of reasons why it was okay. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis wrote about how whenever somebody wrongs you, you say, "What a terrible how could they do? They got to pay." And when you do something wrong, he says, there comes from you a string of excuses as long as your arm, right? It's like, well, I have had a tough day, I have this going on and that going on, because we see ourselves as people, but we don't always see the personhood of others. Nevertheless, Saul says, I had to. And this is really the chief problem with Saul in his story, is Saul seeks to save face. He seeks to put himself in the most positive light, even at the expense of being honest about his life and actions. And so you cannot find forgiveness from God when all you're telling God, in his case, Samuel as God's spokesman, are all of the reasons why what you did wasn't really wrong. We've talked at length about different stories from the Gospels, of course, but you'll find a common thread that the people that find forgiveness from Jesus are the people who intensely are aware of their need for it. It's not the people that say, well, Jesus, let me tell you why I'm a lot better than you think I am. It's the people that come to Jesus and fall at his feet and say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Nevertheless, our chapter ends, that recap aside, our chapter ends with them in a very precarious position. We didn't talk about this section. Let me read for you, starting in verse 15. Really, the second half of verse 15. It's a new paragraph, at least in my Bible. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. Now, I did not calculate the precise mathematics of what percentage of men he's lost, but it's like in the 90th percentile. It's beyond 90th percentile, probably. He's had, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people, and then that got whittled down, and that got whittled down, and now he's only got 600 men with him. And Saul and Jonathan his son, the people who were present with them, and Saul and Jonathan his son and the people who were present with them stayed in Geba of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. And raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies, and one company turned toward Ophrah to the land of Shual, another toward Beth Horon, another company turned toward the border that looks down the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. The idea is they're sending out all these roving bands that are going out and pillaging and plundering and that kind of thing. But here's where our story gets really, really bleak really quickly. Now, this is verse 19, there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, his sickle, and the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, and mattocks, a third for the sharpening, the axes, the setting of the goads. Here's the point, verse 22. So on the day of battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and Jonathan his son had them. So they are looking to fight a battle against an army, and they're going, who's got a sword? And Saul and Jonathan are standing next to each other. They got their sword on their belt. They're like, who else has a sword? Who's got a spear? Who has fists? It's like, what are we going to go to war with here? Who's got a rock? They have nothing. And so we're in a real bind here when we get to verse 23. The garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. So they are hemming them in, and they've got absolutely nothing. And another theme of Scripture is that God tends to show up precisely when the time is the most dire, right? That we see, maybe I shouldn't say it that way, we perceive the work of God the most when we need Him the most. We get to chapter 14, and we're going to encounter a leader with faith, a leader with great faith. It's not Saul, it's Saul's son, Jonathan. Jonathan looks out in chapter 14, and by the way, in this chapter as well as the next chapter, you see a contrast between Jonathan and Saul that is as clear as black and white. I mean, this is polar opposite colors. Jonathan looks at his armor bearer, looks at the situation, maybe based on what we just read in chapter 13, he says, well, we're the only guys with swords here. So we better get busy, let's die trying. But Jonathan in verse 1 of chapter 14 says to the young man carries his armor, let's go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side. But he did not tell his father. Why do you think Jonathan didn't tell his father what his plan was? You ever do something you didn't tell your parents about? I mean, it's just me. Why do you think he didn't tell him? When you did something, now in your case or mine, it may have been something not so good. But when we did something that we didn't want our parents to know, why did we not want them to know? Okay. That's what I was looking for. You thought they might stop you, right? Everything that Jonathan has come to know about Saul, his father, tells him that if he tries to act courageously in faith, his father is going to say, oh, no, you don't. The timidity of Saul is what we're going to find played out in this chapter as well as in other chapters. And Jonathan, he's got a plan, and it's a crazy plan, but it's a plan that is saturated in faith in God at work. And Saul has no plan. It's a conservative plan. He's not going to lose anybody on the battlefield because he's not going to go to battle. He's just going to stay hiding in the caves. And it's a faithless plan. It's a plan that involves no action. Pay attention here to what we read here in verse. Let's skip down to verse 6. Let me just set the stage. These couple verses here. There's a rocky crag, is how the ESV puts it. But and Jonathan and the armor bearer down here. Philistines are up here, and they're going to develop a plan of attack. Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised." And I love this. I preached on this. You may remember this. But he says, "It may be that the Lord will work for us. For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." And his armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you heart and soul." Then Jonathan said, "Behold, we will cross over to the men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say to us, 'Wait until we come to you,' then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we will go up. For the Lord has given them into our hand, and this shall be the sign to us." So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, "Look, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves." And they hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come up to us, and we will show you a thing." Jonathan and his armor bearer, they present themselves as available to God, right? All they're doing is they're saying, hey, we're going to stand here, and we're going to put ourselves in a position to act, and if God gives us the opportunity, we're going to take it. Saul was putting himself in a position of unavailability to God. God couldn't do anything with Saul if he wanted to, because Saul was just hiding in the cave, right? But Jonathan and his armor bearer, they come out and they say, listen, if God chooses to work through us, then we're going to work with all of our might to accomplish what he's trying to accomplish. Go ahead, Mary. For sure.
But the youth
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And you know, and I think that you're probably right there. That is part of the beauty of the church, is a mix of young and old and different backgrounds and all of that. And really the defining thing here is we need people who have faith, right? We need people that have a trust in God that says, I'm going to put myself in a position where I am willing to do something for God. And that's what Jonathan does. And listen, I love his heart because it's a humble heart. You remember when Daniel's friends, I guess I should say, they were pulled before Nebuchadnezzar, and you know, they have their great exchange with him, where they defy his order to bow down to the statue and whatnot. But they say, our God is able to deliver us from this fire, O king. This is my general quotation, a little bit of a paraphrase, but they say our God is able to do this. But even if he doesn't, be it known to you, O king, that we shall not bow down to your idol. So they have an attitude that says, listen, we're available. We're gonna put ourselves in a position of acting in faith, and we're going to be thrown into a furnace for it. And if God wants to deliver us, if that's how he chooses to see fit to make his point clear, he'll deliver us. Or if he's going to use our death in this furnace to inspire others to cling to their faith, they see that we didn't renounce even in this context, then that'll be okay too, right? And you see the difference in like the early church and the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There were many Christians that were killed even in the book of Acts. You're starting to see persecution, right? And Stephen is killed. And God didn't intervene in Stephen's life, right? He didn't come to his rescue and say, you're not going to stone him. Why? Because God had his objective. He had his mission in mind and had the wisdom to know what to do. But I can tell you that Stephen wasn't doing the right thing because he knew, I've got a guarantee from God that they can't hurt me. He was doing it because he was going to put himself in a position of availability that God could use him for the mission. And certainly God did use his life and testimony for the mission of Jesus. I mean, his story is near and dear to all of our hearts and something that we can recall in times of persecution.
It's sort of like Isaiah was like that.
Yeah.
When the Lord said, who are we going to send? And he didn't say, George or Sam. They're decided to say, I'm here, let me go.
Right. Yeah, great point. Absolutely. And so many others we could add to that as well. So God honors Jonathan's faith. And they get summoned up, and they climb up, and literally in verse 14 it says, that first strike which Jonathan and his armor bearer made killed about 20 men within, as it were, half a furrow's length and an acre of land. And there was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. Okay, so at this point, Saul, in his hiding place, he sees out that there's this great panic and there's an opportune moment to go and act. And so now finally Saul chooses to go and fight in the battle. And as a result, Israel causes to flee a number of Philistines. A lot of them die in the battle, but then some are running away such that they're scattered completely. So what the point that I thought was really interesting here when we think about a leader with faith, Jonathan was only really responsible for taking out 20 of this garrison of hundreds of Philistine warriors. He was only responsible single-handedly for taking out 20. But because he chose to step out in faith and actually lead the charge, it resulted in a much larger victory for the people of God. It's not just that what he did was a great personal act of faith. It brought about faith. in other people, because he said, look what God can do, right? Not literally, but they look out and they're saying, God's doing something here. The earth's quaking. Okay, let's go out and let's fight in this battle. We're going to join with Jonathan and with the armor bearer. It reminds me personally of the parable of the talents. Remember the parable, Jesus says, hey, one's got 10, 5, and 1. And the person with 10 made 20. The person with 5 made 10. But what did the person with 1 do? Yeah, he multiplied it by 1, right? He got still 1. He buried it in the dirt. And the master comes and says, there's a problem that we have here. What's the problem? I kept everything safe, just the way that you left it. And the master said, do you ever think about inflation? No, he didn't say that. He said, don't you know that I am capable of prospering where I don't even sow? So you kept this thing so protected and safe, but you didn't realize that I actually entrusted it to you so that you would multiply it out. Now, does that have anything to do with the Christian mission, right? We've been entrusted with something, but the purpose of our being entrusted with it is to multiply it in the world, is to make disciples of all nations. And we'll talk more about that this morning. But in the parable, the 1 talent person, and by the way, talent isn't about like natural gifting. We use the word talent today to refer to I can speak well, or I can write, or I can whatever, I can lead this or serve there or do whatever. That's not what talent meant. It meant money. It's an analogy, right, about more than just, he's not saying, well, some people, they've got a lot of natural gifting, though that might be the case. He's just saying some people have a lot of resources, natural gifts, money, whatever at their disposal, others not as much. But the defining mark is not how much you have, but what you do with what you have, right? Saul had much. If you go back in the story, Samuel says as much. But he was acting in fear and more about self-preservation than he was about faithfulness. Jonathan had little. He had a sword and a faithful friend. And that was enough. That was enough to deliver the people. And Jonathan was exactly right when he said that the Lord is capable of saving by many or by few. So we want to be cautioned against failing to realize that the master can multiply, right? What is small into something much bigger if we'll present ourselves as available in faith. Well, let's move then from there and let's talk about the other guy, Saul, a leader with pride. There's a leader with faith and there's a leader with pride. And we're not going to read, we don't have time to read this whole section here, and there's interesting things in it, but I'll just make some big picture points. You remember in chapter 13, Jonathan goes out and he defeats a bunch of Philistines, and what does Saul do? Saul has done an amazing thing in the land, right? Everything is going well because of what Saul has done. Well, in chapter 14, Saul again makes Israel's victory about himself. Notice in verse 24. And then the men of Israel had been hard pressed that day. So Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." So none of the people had tasted food. The text literally is saying the people are exhausted from their battle that they've been waging. They've been fighting in a battle, hand-to-hand combat all day. And Saul says, until I am fully satisfied with this, we're not going to eat. In our stories in the Bible, usually when leaders are acting according to the way of the Lord, they're viewing their the enemies of the people primarily through God's vantage point, not through their own. But Saul makes it about me. I'm going to get even on these guys, and you're not going to eat anything until I do. Those who lead with pride usually make their team go through unnecessary suffering. Because rather than focusing on the objectives, they're focused on themselves. And pride has unintended consequences. If we called this section something else, we could say, the unintended consequences of pride, because that's everything that happens in this next section. He declares that these warriors who have been waging battle, they can't taste food until he gets what he wants. And there's a lot of parallels here between legalism, the adding of additional rules and regulations to what we do as Christians. It's a form of pride for the same reason that what Saul does is a form of pride. It's the idea of if I can just add this and this and this and this and this, then I can be satisfied, right? Or God will be satisfied with me. I'll have merited something from God if I can just follow all of these additional external rules. But whenever we add rules or regulations to what God has revealed to us, it always causes problems. In the case of this chapter, Jonathan doesn't know about the rule. Jonathan didn't tell his dad he was going to war. Dad didn't tell him that he was going to ban food, okay? Jonathan's walking through the woods, and there's honey dripping down off the trees, pooling up on the ground. I mean, the way that the writer puts this, it's like, you walk around the corner and suddenly it's just a field of honey everywhere. And Jonathan takes, I think his staff, if I remember right, and he scoops up some honey and he eats it, and everyone goes, oh, what did he do? One of the people said in verse 28, your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, cursed be the man who eats food this day. And the people were faint. Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. Jonathan highlights the problem, which we'll see in just a moment as well. But in verses 31 through 35, the people are so exhausted, the soldiers are so exhausted, they start literally pouncing on livestock and eating it raw. Sheep, calves, whatever. They're eating a bunch of raw livestock with the blood, as the text says. And Saul hears about this, and he is enraged with them, and he says, you have dealt treacherously to the people. Roll a great stone here to me. And so he starts, cooking all this meat and everything. But he's furious with the people. But still, he continues to make his plans. He continues to say, we'll do what I say and when I say it. And in verse 36, I love this exchange, is hilarious to me. Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light. Let us not leave a man of them. And the people said, do whatever seems good to you. But the priest said, let us draw near to God here. The priest said, you ever think about talking to God about this first? People are kind of tired here. I haven't been hearing much from God on this one, Saul. Maybe we should stop. Saul stops. They try to inquire from the Lord, but he did not answer him that day. And Saul just knows. He says, boy, you are a wicked people, aren't you? You eating this meat over here. That's why God's not answering, is because of how truly wicked you are. And he said, I'm so confident in this. If you remember the story, he said, I'm so confident in this. Jonathan, you come over. Me and Jonathan are going to stand here. And you, the whole nation of Israel, you stand over there, and we'll flip a coin, not really the Uman and thumbing the 2 stones they had. But we'll flip a coin. If it comes up heads, you're the problem. If it comes up tails, we're the problem. And so he said, oh, this is going to be great, Tails. Tails. This is a bad coin, And so then he said, well, listen, Jonathan, me? Okay, let me flip it. It comes up Jonathan, and Jonathan says, yeah, I ate some honey. Why did you do such a dumb thing? Okay, this is me paraphrasing, but it's like, and Saul says, and this is basically a word for word, well, I'll give it to you word for word, so you know exactly what he says. God do so to me and more also, you shall surely die, Jonathan. Leaders who act in pride are typically prone to anger getting the best of them when they're made to look less than they would like. When their image takes a hit, they typically lash out in rage. God help me, I'm going to kill you, he says to Jonathan. It is the people in verse 45 who say to Saul, shall Jonathan die? The one who worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not be one hair of his head fall to the ground. He has worked with God this day. So the people ransomed Jonathan, so they did not die. Text just says, then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. Saul left. We get this in the end of chapter 14, a little summary that, yes, God did work through Saul to eliminate a lot of Israel's threats against Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, all these different people. He had a bunch of sons in verse 49 and following. But verse 52 says this, there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself. Saul is interested in getting the approval of the right people. He's interested in, just like at the very beginning, he's got his band of valiant people. And so he says, I don't care what the worthless people say. I've got these. He's accumulating power by latching on to various. Who's going to be one of those young, valiant men who Saul attaches himself to?
Davy.
What's that?
Davy.
Davy, yeah, exactly. Not Crockett, not Jones. I don't know what David's last. Of Jesse, right? David. And so he is, we're getting the stage set even more here that Saul has a problem. And his problem is everything he does for approval of others. Public approval. That's what Saul does. Make his name great, make him look good. And it results in his rejection as the king of Israel. In chapter 15, this is a story you're familiar with, I'm sure, or at least you may be familiar with. I shouldn't say that, but you may be familiar with in chapter 15. Saul has been tasked in verses 1 through 3 of going and waging more battle against God's enemies. And so they go out in the following verses, 4 and following. They go out and they're attacking, and then they're successful, and they defeat Agag, the Amalekite. And so they're supposed to destroy everything. And in verse 9 it says, Saul and the people spared Agag the king, and the best of the sheep and of the oxen, of the fattened calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. Well, how convenient that is. God is grieved by by Saul's rebelliousness. Samuel comes in a rage to Saul and says, what have you done? And Saul says, we've won a great victory. I have thoroughly done what God asked me to do. And Samuel asks Saul, do you remember the question he asked him?
What about the bleating of sheep?
What's this bleating of sheep in my ears? And Saul says, whoa. You remember back in chapter 13 when I had those great excuses? Well, I've got some more for you. And he says, well, these people, they're really wicked. They won't do what I say. What can I do? You know, what can I do? They have brought them from the Amalekites, in verse 15. For the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen. But listen, even the people, don't be too hard on them. They did it to sacrifice to the Lord your God. The rest we have devoted to destruction. Samuel said to Saul, stop. Enough. Parents, you ever have to tell your child, stop. Enough. He says, I will tell you what the Lord said to me this night. Verse 17 gives us the description of Saul. It is, if you want to know, like, this is the verse that clarifies everything you need to know about Saul. It is this verse. Samuel said to Saul, though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. The Lord sent you on a mission and said. So he goes on and says, why didn't you obey and all that? But what did we just learn about Saul's mindset? He was little in his own eyes. What does that mean? What's that? Humble.
Prideless, I guess. I mean, what, didn't have much pride?
Well, I'm not sure that it's not the opposite of that.
Oh.
He didn't see past himself. He was so little
Yeah.
that it was all about Saul.
Yeah, he had the problem where he had such a low view of himself that he couldn't stop thinking about himself, right? He constantly needed other people to prop him up as though, tell me how good I am. Tell me that I matter. Tell me that I'm strong. Tell me that I'm a good leader. Tell me. That's why he needs to send out a trumpeter to say, look at Saul's successes. That's why he needs to make them take vows and oaths. I'm going to get my revenge. That's why he hates when David gets glorified and he gets humiliated in later passages. It's because humility, and I may have said this last week, but humility is not about thinking poorly of yourself. It's learning to stop thinking about yourself so much. Right? It's learning that it's not about you. It's about what God is doing. Well, Saul made everything about him. And his ego was so fragile that any objection, anyone else getting credit was a threat to him. And Samuel said, you are telling yourself all the wrong things about yourself. Look at what God has done for you. He has made you the king of this entire people. He's anointed you. He sent you on missions. Look at what God has done for you. Is it not the case that in our own life we can get into a state where we forget that what God says about us is where we should find our identity? That what God says about us should matter more even than our feelings in a particular moment. That our identity comes not from how other people approve of us. Our identity doesn't even come from whether we approve of us. Our identity comes from the fact that in Christ, God approves of us.
When did that start, though? I mean, did it start after? Because this translates it, although you once considered yourself unimportant.
Yeah.
But is it because he was appointed king, then he started this characterization like you're talking about?
Yeah, I think he's asking him a rhetorical question here. The way that I have understood this verse is more the way that I just read it to you, where he's asking him, he's saying, though you continue to look at yourself as the guy hiding behind the baggage needing me to prop you up, look at what God has done. That's how I understand it. Now, that might be might not be the way that it is, but that's the way that I have understood it. Everything I see about Saul communicates to me that he remained a little in his own eyes and tried to bring himself up in other people by getting, or in other people's estimation, so that he could feel like he had some kind of importance. That's the way that I understand it. But let me show you an example of this in this chapter, and then we'll have to be done. In verse 12, we'll go back just a little bit. Saul conquers the Agag and all that. They don't kill everybody like they're supposed to, but they conquer them. Now look at this. Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning, and it was told to Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, and turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal. He was so proud of his accomplishment, he said, we need to have a statue of me to commemorate this great day. So, Dan, really we're saying the same thing either way you take it. Either if Samuel is saying to him, you used to be humble, now you're not. That's really what I'm saying, is he's really not humble. Now, humility takes two different forms. Pride takes two different forms. Sometimes it's always thinking poorly of yourself. Sometimes it's the other way around. Either way, that's Saul's problem. He sets up this monument of himself and says, I have done a great thing. And by the end of this passage, he's lost his kingship altogether. Here's the takeaways, just something to think about. God works through us best when we make the most room for him in our lives. That's the story of Jonathan. When we tell God, I'm available, use me in whatever way, show me an opportunity to do something for Jesus, God works through us best when we make the most room for him in our lives. Partial obedience to God is equivalent to disobedience. That's the story of Saul. And then finally, pride devastates not only a person. Saul is in a constant internal tumult, if you will, but he also devastates everybody in his orbit. Next week we'll meet Davy, as Dan said, and we'll get to see the next king begin.